All right, we are still working on the First Amendment freedom of religion, and we're talking about the Establishment Clause at this point in time. The court has not always been consistent in what it allows and what it prohibits in terms of the Establishment Clause. And very often, custom and tradition and public perception come into play more than legal theories, I think, at times. If you think about it closely, on different parts of our currency, we have the phrase, "In God we trust." Congress opens its session every day with a prayer and actually has an official chaplain that is rotated between the various religious groups in the country from time to time. The state legislatures are allowed to begin their sessions with prayers, and even the Supreme Court itself and many of the other lesser courts in the country begin the day with their sheriffs calling out, "God save the United States of America and this honorable court." So there is no blanket prohibition that the government can't have anything to do with religion or can't touch it in any aspect or can't have any shade of it involved in anything they do. Um, there is a great misconception out in the general public and promulgated to a certain extent by the mass media that religion, the First Amendment prohibition on establishing a religion, means that religion needs to be basically um, removed completely from the public square, from all open and public activities, from the airways, from almost anything that goes on be outside the walls of a particular religious group's institution itself. That is not the law. It is, as I said, very much a popular perception at times, but it is not the law. And there is a good deal of mingling between um, the church and the state. And the Supreme Court over the years has had to wrestle with that and has to try to come up with some rules for determining how much is enough and when have folks gone too far. Um, One of the large areas that has been problematic, particularly in the Northeast, the older states, and the big cities. Um, Religious schools from kindergarten and pre kindergarten right up through college were major institutions, and for certain parts of the 19th and 20th centuries, the majority of children going to school may have been going to religious institutions. The Roman Catholic Church particularly had a incredibly large school system that encompass every major city and town in the country, but even many of the smaller Protestant churches and groups had their own religious schools as well. There's certainly Jewish schools. And the issue there has always been that in most states, particularly in the eastern part of the country, such as Rhode Island and Massachusetts and New Hampshire, the constitutions of the states actually guarantee every student the right to an education. And many children, and probably certainly today, most children are educated in their early years by the state with tax dollars. In fact, us here at CCRI, we're a state institution, and as much as you may feel like your tuition is excessive, we would not all be here without the fact that the state government dumps a large amount of money into us each year to provide the possibility for you to obtain an education and to take leave of the services that we offer here. Um, there was always a temptation, particularly when the religious schools were far more prevalent than they are now, for the public authorities to attempt to assist them for two reasons. One is you had parents who were paying for their children to go to private schools while they were paying taxes to support the public school system that they were not utilizing. And many parents resented this. Many politicians, trying to win favor with their voters whose children went to these private schools, would attempt to somehow move tax dollars over to the religious side of the educational system in an attempt to placate their voters. And the reality was, for a good part of the 20th century at least, the religious schools were so extensive that had they shut down, had the Catholic school system in any of the big cities gone to the public school system and said, "Hi, as of next year, we don't have enough money. We're not running. We're giving you all of our 20,000 students in New York, or 5,000 in Boston, or 15,000 in Chicago." the public school systems would have collapsed. They would not have been able to take up the number of students and provide education. So there was kind of a funny relationship that has subsisted to a great deal because the court had laid down some rules and made it somewhat clear as to what can be done and not done, and the prevalence of religious-backed schools has begun to decline, I would say, today. I don't have the statistics at hand, but just from looking at reality, a vast majority of students are in the public school system. They're not in religiously founded or run schools. One of the major cases in this area was a case called Lemon versus Kurtzman, and it combined a couple of situations, one of which was from Rhode Island, and the other one was from, where was the other one? Was, I believe, Pennsylvania. Both cases had educational systems where there were large Catholic schools in the major cities, and both states passed legislation attempting to give funding to the Catholic schools and other private religious schools, even to the extent of paying the salaries of certain teachers. The Supreme Court looked at that and basically said, no, when it got to the point of paying salaries in a religious school, that is too much entanglement. The state is then involving itself in the day-to-day practice of a religious institution, and that is too much. However, the court over the years has backed away from Lemon to a certain extent. They still do not allow teachers to be paid to go into the Catholic schools, even if a child is entitled to certain special educational programs that exist today. Those programs cannot be run within the religious schools. The students must be taken out of the religious school to a public school to obtain those services. But the courts have allowed things such as supplying buses, loaning books, computer equipment to religious schools on the grounds that such things are not involved with religious teaching or indoctrination per se, and will be generally under the police powers of the state, would be helpful to the education and welfare of the students in those schools. One of the big issues that arose in the early part of the 20th century, in the 1920s, then seemed to die down, but then flourished again recently in the late 20th century and early 2000s, was the idea of argument over what can be taught in public schools. In 1925, there was a famous case, I believe it was out of Tennessee, called the Scopes Monkey Trial. The state in that situation had passed a law making the teaching of evolution illegal. Now, I may have to educate you guys at the moment because society and life has changed tremendously in 100 years. But at the time when Darwin promulgated his theory of evolution in the late 1800s, it was seen as something as completely heretical and anti-biblical and totally anathema to many of the Christian churches and Christian denominations. They refused to accept evolution. They believed in the inerrancy of the Bible, that the creation stories of the Catholic and Jewish scripture were the absolute truth, and people fought bitterly to keep evolution from being taught to their children as a subject. And as I said, in the state of Tennessee, they had a law prohibiting public school teachers from teaching evolution to their students. Mr. Scopes was a science teacher in a school. He taught evolution. He was charged criminally for doing so. And there was a very, very famous trial that went on. These were in the early days of radio, so certain parts of it, I don't believe the trial itself was carried on radio, but every night what had gone on at the trial was relayed across the radio waves, and people across the country were paying attention to this trial. And Scopes lost. The jury found him guilty of illegally teaching evolution. The case went up to the Supreme Court of the state, and the state overturned the conviction. So there was no chance to bring this to the Supreme Court itself, but this was the beginning of a long and drawn out century-long fight over who has control over what is taught in the public schools. Do the parents, based on their religious and social beliefs and moral beliefs, have the right to control what the schools are teaching to their children? Now, to a great extent, I'd have to say the parents have lost that battle in many regards, and most court decisions as they came down in the different lower courts and appeals courts have tended to side with the educational authorities and with the teachers and say that the parents or particular sets of parents do not have the right to control what is being taught in the public school system. Going to the other side of this argument, it popped back up again in the 1990s and early 2000s that some states, instead of banning evolution, tried to pass statutes saying that creationism, or the biblical view of how the world came to be, had to be taught along with evolution. I do not know of any Supreme Court case that heard that, but the lower courts have been pretty much unanimous in saying that the states do not have the power to do that. They cannot force, again, that is the teaching of a religious belief, that is establishing a religious belief in the public schools, and the states do not have the right to do that. The court has been much less concerned about dealing with colleges and universities that have religious orientation than with elementary and grammar schools. They do allow the states to provide certain types of funding to colleges and universities, even though if they're religiously founded institutions, on a couple of theories. One is usually, again, it's not for the paying of teachers or for the teaching of particular courses. It's in the giving of scholarships or aid money or student loan money or providing money for facilities. And the court is much less concerned about the indoctrination of adults. At this point in time, most people who are entering college are 18, they are the age of adulthood, and they are not children who are impressionable and could be swayed in their beliefs by what is being taught by teachers in the government schools. Where did I want to go? There was something else I wanted to talk to about this. School all right. Another aspect of government establishment of religion has been played out beginning in the 1960s, when a number of atheist groups decided that they did not want any religious symbols to be part of the public political life, to be part of any governmental situation, and they began bringing lawsuits on that. And again, it's very difficult because we still have Christmas and Thanksgiving, our public holidays on both state and federal level, both of which have a religious origin and a religious side to them. But they still exist, and they're still held, and we shut down the society and the government on those days. In 1984, there was a case out of Pawtucket called Lynch v. Donnelly. If any of you are familiar with the City Hall in downtown Pawtucket, it's along the Blackstone River, and it has a fairly decent-sized piece of land on either side of it that are usually maintained as lawns, although I think one of them has been turned into mostly a parking lot for city employees. But going back into the 1980s, there were these broad lawns on either side of the City Hall, and as December came along, Thanksgiving came along, every year the city would set up a display for Christmas. And the display would have Santa Claus and snowmen and reindeer and Christmas trees and stars and angels and the nativity scene with the baby Jesus, Mary, and Joseph in it, and the three kings. And that was generally done. I believe it was actually in those days owned by the city, set up by the city, by city employees. The city paid for the electricity. And I distinctly remember that Christmas carols would be played on loudspeakers annoyingly through that entire period. maybe 24 hours a day. I was only usually there during business hours, but it certainly was played, and sometimes loud enough you could hear it through the whole building of City Hall. Um, Somebody complained. The ACLU took up their case and supported them, gave them an attorney, and they complained that this was a religious display and that the city had no right to set it up, had no right to do this, and the court should force it to come down. It worked its way all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court handed down a decision. And in the decision, to the surprise of a number of people, the Supreme Court said, no, this display was okay. But the reason they said it was okay was interesting. What they said was it was so much to do with just the secular idea of the winter holidays, snowmen, icicles, evergreen trees, stars, none of which had particular religious significance. That even though there were, and I believe by that point in time, there was both a creche or manger scene with the showing the Christ child, as well as a menorah set up for the Jewish citizens of the city of Pawtucket. The court said that there's so much going on here. This is not an endorsement or an establishment of any particular religion. It's a winter holiday scene, and if the city wants to put in some innocuous religious symbols along with all the secular symbols, then that's fine. That is not enough of an entanglement to violate the Establishment Clause. And that's one of the things, when they talked about the school cases, that's one of the things that the court also concentrated on and would come back to many times, is the idea of entanglement, is that they don't want the situation to reach a point where the religious people are telling the city how to do things, or where the city is telling the religious people how to do things. They want to keep their affairs as separate as possible. And that's how the court, over a number of cases over many years, that's how they tended to view the Establishment Clause. It's that it's all right to do little things around the edges, but as soon as we get to the point where we're kind of dictating each other's procedures and what's supposed to be going on and happening, then we've gone too far. Now, one of the big questions in all of this has to do with tax-exempt status. In Europe, traditionally, for 1,500 years, the church was a separate political as well as religious entity. The kings and the governments had no power over the church. The church had its own laws, its own courts, its own structure of raising tithes to run itself, and the government taxation structure and everything else operated apart from the church and had no authority or control over the church. And without thinking about it much, that was sort of carried over into the colonies when the British first arrived. And so the idea, long before the Constitution or the Bill of Rights was set up, the idea was firmly implanted in that religious and educational institutions are not taxable by the government, that they have a special status in society, and as such, the government has no right to control them, has no right to tax them. There have been a number of attempts to change this, citing the fact that a number of religious groups control vast sums of money at this point in time, and that this all goes on without being taxed and without having any government control or regulation. But the court has been fairly hesitant to enter into this area. And again, there's almost the attitude on the part of the court cases that were the government to start taxing the churches, that would become an entanglement in their affairs, because just like any business person who has had to deal with the IRS and all the regulations, the minute the government starts taxing you, they're looking into what you're doing, what is your business, how much money are you making, where are you spending it, did you really qualify for that exemption or that exception? And so the courts have kind of taken the view that no, the tax exempt status is probably a good thing, because for the government to try to be regulating the income and determining how much of it they could take from churches and religious organizations would only create that entanglement that they don't like to see. However, there have been some exceptions to that. In the 1970s, Bob Jones University had refused to accept racial minority students, and the IRS, one of the IRS regulations said that any institution that discriminated racially would lose its tax exempt status. They revoked Bob Jones's exempt status as a religious educational institution, and the Supreme Court upheld that and said, "Yep, that's within the purview of the tax code that to enforce discrimination, the government could use the tax code." There has been great discussion over the years, and the charter school movement kind of arose out of these discussions and the stalemate that was here of the government giving vouchers, so that the government spends $4,000 or $5,000 on each child to educate them each year. And the idea came about, well, if I want to send my child to a non-government school, why don't you give me that amount of money that you'd be spending on them in the public school, and I can take that and use it towards paying tuition at a private school. The Supreme Court initially was very resistant to this. The argument in favor was that, well, that's not entanglement. You just write a check once a year, and nobody's controlling anybody's business or belief structures or whatever. But in recent years, the courts have begun little by little to give more allowance to these types of things. And again, the charter school system, as it's come to develop, works in a similar type way. And although most charter schools are not religiously orientated, they are privately run. They're alternative institutions. And the idea of a charter school is that if a child leaves the public school system to enter a charter school, the charter school does get the amount of money that would have been allocated to that child by the public school department. Last of all, in this area of entanglement, in 1954, then Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, who subsequently went on to become President Lyndon B. Johnson, presented to Congress and got passed something called the Johnson Amendment to the IRS code. And the Johnson Amendment basically said that any organization recognized under the IRS code, which is affectionately called a 501c3 organization, because that's the section of the IRS code that creates tax-exempt entities or allows for tax-exempt entities, that any institution that was seeking tax-exempt status under the code could not engage in political activity as in exchange for being given tax-exempt status. This has been bitterly discussed and argued about and fought over the years. And what is the extent of it? To how far does it go? There have been situations where certain churches and ministers and preachers have been penalized just for giving a sermon or a homily or one talk about political parties or political candidates. Certainly, religious organizations are not allowed to contribute to political campaigns. It has become a very difficult issue. President Trump basically suspended enforcement of this about 2 years ago now, because there are many issues in society: immigration, abortion, the rights of people to obtain food stamps and health insurance, are moral and religious issues for many people, as well as being political issues. So very hard to separate. And many different religious groups have very strong beliefs on these areas that also come under the political purview today. So I think, if anything, you will see some changes coming down the pike. Certainly the Democrats at this point seem to be in favor of the Johnson Amendment. Republicans, by and large, seem to be against it. We saw, going back to the earlier part of this course, religion is now coming into play with in the Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado case, where the civil rights laws are coming up toe-to-toe with First Amendment rights of an individual to provide goods and services. And we saw that the Supreme Court case that dealt with that basically was able to punt the question by saying that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission behaved in a way that was totally inimical to the religious beliefs and rights of the baker, refused to consider them or give them any proper recognition at all, and therefore they threw the whole case out of the Supreme Court and back to the states. These issues, they come and go in our society. They seem to have periods where they're very active, when they're not. But I would venture to say we may be coming into a time where we're going to see more cases and more arguments over these types of things. All right, before I end our discussions on the First Amendment, I would just say I've been working in this lecture and the one just before it off of a handout called Religious Liberty in Church and State Relations as part of the Note 7. There's another one called First Amendment Free Exercise Establishment Clause, which goes through in shorthand form a number of cases that have to do with this area of the law. I'm not going to give a lecture on them at this point in time, but if you are interested in learning more about this, or even having a basis, if you want to do research in this area, I do have that list for you with an explanation of what the various cases stood for and what the holdings were to kind of help you navigate this type of situation. Which reminds me, before I leave, counterpoint to Lynch v. Donnelly, the Pawtucket case where the Supreme Court said, "Oh yeah, have your Christmas display." A couple of years later, 5 years later, a case called Allegheny County versus Greater Pittsburgh ACLU. ACLU is the American Civil Liberties Union, which is an organization of attorneys that volunteer their services to fight constitutional law issues on behalf of citizens. In this case, within the main court building of Allegheny County, there was a nativity scene set up on one of the stairways that everybody had to pass by in order to get to their hearings and their court cases or the clerk's office. And it was a manger scene of the baby Jesus, Mary, and Joseph with angels and the three kings, and with the banner Gloria and Excelsis Deo, which, for those of you who don't speak Latin, means glory to God in the highest over it. And the Supreme Court struck that down and said that that was exclusively religious, that it favored only one religion, and being in a court situation where people have to go. Very often you are dragged into court for one reason or another. You're not there voluntarily because you want to go pay your taxes in person or something at City Hall. And they said that in that situation, that was so religious that it was violating the Establishment Clause, and the county had to take that down. They were not allowed to do that. In more recent years, in the 2010s, there were cases in Alabama and Texas having to do with the Ten Commandments being displayed. In Texas, they were displayed on the state capitol grounds, and the Supreme Court said that that was innocuous and okay. I believe in Alabama, they were displayed again in courts, and the Supreme Court said no, that is not allowed. Interesting note, the Supreme Court building in Washington itself does have some murals depicting Moses in the handing down of the Ten Commandments and some other religious lawgivers over the years. So again, very complicated area, very mixed area in terms of what happens with the courts. All right, enough for that. We'll be moving on to topic 8 after this.